I consider myself one of the luckiest people in the world because my 20 years as a financial advisor happened to overlap with 20 of the strongest years in the stock market and 20 years where inflation was basically beaten. And now the question is, some of these academic studies, some of these guidelines that I've used for 20 years, that many of you have heard about over the last 20 years, with inflation no longer tamed, with inflation potentially out of control, potentially not tamed again, do the rules of the industry still work? And most importantly, does the 4% rule still work? Let's jump in and talk about it because it's a super important question. Remember, the 4% rule is just trying to answer the question, you've worked your whole life, you've saved up a set amount of money, let's say it's $500,000, let's say it's $1 million, and the question is, how much money can you take out of that account every year and not have to worry about running out of money over a 30-year time horizon? And the 4% rule was first put together, first thought through by a gentleman in my industry, one of the fathers of financial planning, William Bengen. And he wrote a report on this in 1994. And his insight was really to use a statistical tool called Monte Carlo simulations to look at thousands of different lifetimes, thousands of different probabilities, and give people guidance and say, we don't have certainty, but we have a high level of confidence. We have some clarity. We have a 97% likelihood of you not running out of money if you only spend 4% a year and inflate that. So that's essentially the rule, but the question is, does it still hold when inflation is 3%, 4%, 5%? And William Bengen updated his 4% rule in 2021. And he revised it from 4% to 4.7%. And that's a big deal. That's almost an 18% increase. That's a raise, if you will, that William Bengen says that instead of 4%, we can pay ourselves a little bit more money. And that's for, in this case, a portfolio that's half stocks and half bonds. So let's dig in and really try to answer the question, how does inflation impact this 4% rule, and do we need to change it based on what we know of inflation? Okay, so there's been a couple major improvements, major digging deeper into the 4% rule. In 2008, gentleman, another thought leader in the financial planning industry, Michael Kitces, K-I-T-C-E-S, came up and said, well, you know, how much you can spend in retirement really depends on how expensive the stock market is. If the stock market's at an all-time high, guess what? Likely the returns aren't going to be as high over the next 10 years, over the next 20 years. So his insight, he really built on Bengen's work and said, well, let's look at stock market valuation. And there's something called the CAPE ratio, cyclically adjusted PE ratio, but it's essentially how expensive is the stock market. And Kitces broke down the stock market into 5 different quintiles. And he said at the highest quintile, that's where you get the 4% rule. When Kitces did it, he came up with 4.5%, which again is not insignificantly different from 4%. That's a 10% raise on the money that you can safely take out of your account. So Kitces added to this thinking with his looking at the stock market valuation. So use basically the same data set as Bengen. Okay, and this stock market valuation, when he did it, it went all the way from the highest quintile, right, the 20% most expensive time in the stock market. That was a PE ratio, a price to earnings ratio of about 18 to 28. Well, guess where the market is now, that same CAPE ratio? As of a couple months ago, it was a little over 32. So we're even higher than that. So again, Kitces said 4.5% even with that. Okay, so now the ball's back in Bengen's court. Bengen is still with us. He's in his late 70s, maybe his early 80s, I'm not sure. But a couple years ago, he did a talk, it was in 2021, I believe, where he looked at Kitces' work remember, Bengen's work is first, then Kitces improved on it, and now Kitces is coming in, Bengen is coming and saying, let me improve on the improvement that was done on my work. And so Bengen says, hey, I like what Kitces did, looking at stock market valuation, that makes sense, but we're missing something, and we're missing something really important, which gets back to the title of this article. How do we factor in inflation? And that's what this chart here talks about. Now, I want to talk about when Bengen originally did this study in 1994. Now, this is looking at 30-year rolling returns. So the Bengen study was backward looking, as by default that we can't look forward because we don't know what's going to happen. So his work, remember in the 80s, in the early 80s, the late 70s, we were fighting really high inflation. So his work initially took inflation into consideration. So if a client had asked me, hey, Azul, what do you think about high inflation? Does that change the 4% rule? My gut would have said no, because the original study included periods of high inflation. Again, remember, 1994, Bengen's original study. 10 years later, 15 years later, Kitces improves it by looking at stock market valuation when you first retire. And now in 2021, 13 years later, Bengen's coming back and saying, I'm going to improve Kitces' work that was improving on mine, and I'm going to look at inflation. That was Kitces' main look. And so here you can see that Bengen broke down periods of time into low inflation, which is 0 to 2.5%, moderate inflation, which is 2.5 to 5%, and high inflation, which is more than 5%. So recently we were just in a high inflation period. Currently we're in what Kitces would call a moderate inflation. And in moderate inflation times, you can look at this chart and it shows what the withdrawal rates are. And you can see the moderate inflation is where you get the highest withdrawal rate. So in this case, the withdrawal rates are 6 to 9%. Now, do I think you should take 9% out of your portfolio? No, I want to be perfectly clear. I do not. Do I think 4% is a risky withdrawal rate? No, I don't. I think the number's probably somewhere 4 to 6%. And the other thing, I think it helps to be a little bit of an optimist in realizing that you can adjust and the world can adjust based on what is currently happening. So, you know, fortunately in the capitalist system, there's a lot of things that are hard about a capitalist system, right? I mean, it's nice for the folks that are in the top 10%, but I would argue in today's world, if you're not in the top 10% in the United States, life is getting harder and harder, right? Particularly as we get older. In my parents' generation, there were 3 legs to the retirement stool. We had Social Security. We still have Social Security, but now it's taxed. Now there's an asterisk next to Social Security. And people save their own money back in my parents' generation. But for many people, there was a 3rd leg to that stool, which was a pension from their employer. That 3rd leg for most of us, unless you work for a government entity, either at the state or the federal level, or in a university, for the most part, those pensions are gone now. Companies have decided, you know what, that's just too expensive of a benefit. We're going to put that off on the individual. And I don't blame the corporations for doing it, but it is our reality. So again, Bengen, you know, said 4%. Do I think that's too high? No, I don't. Do I think 9%, 10% is a reasonable withdrawal rate? I wish I did, but no, I don't. I think that's probably aggressive. So the numbers likely, I don't know your situation. This is not financial advice for you. I do want you to work with a financial advisor yourself. But I think the number's likely somewhere in between those two numbers. It's 4% and 9%. And that's where you have to work with a professional and do some deep thinking and ask yourself, are you willing to make adjustments if you find yourself unfortunate? And if you are, I think you can probably spend a little bit more now, realizing you might have to throttle back later. So the question, does the sustainable withdrawal rate, does the 4% rate still work in a world of high inflation? I think it does, but we have the developer of that rule himself, William Bengen, answering that question. And that's what this video is about. I'll also leave a link to that article where Bengen is interviewed in it. I will leave you with that. The reporter asked Bengen after his talk, you know, what's your take on the current situation, the current inflation situation, the current stock market situation? And Bengen himself answered, it's off the charts. We're in unprecedented territory. So Bengen's being cautious, and I think all of us would be wise to be cautious as well. I think we'd all be wise to enjoy the journey between now and retirement as well, and that's what this video up here is. 7 things that I want you to stop doing in your 50s in order to enjoy the journey until retirement more. I'll see you in that video. Thanks for watching this one. Bye-bye.